A fine drizzle turned the cemetery paths into a muddy mess. Aurora Sterling stood by the freshly dug grave, tugging at the black ribbon on the sleeve of her dress. Her father, Police Captain Theodore Caldwell, stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder. His usually straight back now seemed a little hunched, as if he had aged several years in the last 2 weeks. Braxton hadn't come to the funeral. "Sorry, honey. I've got an important meeting with investors, work." His voice on the phone sounded guilty, but somehow fake. Aurora didn't bother to argue. Lately, she often noticed how her husband avoided communication with her family, especially with her father. Aurora couldn't let go of the thought that her mother had been alive a month ago. Oncology had left no chance. From diagnosis to death was less than a year. Elizabeth Caldwell spent her last days at home, refusing to be hospitalized. "I don't want to die in a hospital," she said at the time. Braxton wasn't around when her mom died either. He was away on business in the city again, though Aurora begged him to stay. "Honey, I can't cancel an important meeting. Call me if anything happens." Those words still reverberated with bitterness. She never called him then, just sat holding her mom's cooling hand while her father called the service. The priest finished reading the prayer. Aurora threw a handful of earth on the coffin lid, watching the clods of clay smash against the polished wood. Theodore sobbed quietly, the first time she'd seen her father cry in all this time. The phone in her purse vibrated. Aurora frowned. She had asked everyone not to bother her today. The screen popped up with the name of Mrs. Parker, their neighbor. "Aurora, dear, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're having today. Anyway, I just wanted to ask, is everything okay? It's just that there's been loud music coming from your house for the past hour, and I thought—" Aurora clicked off before she could listen. In their house? Music? Something inside her clenched. Gradually, the cemetery emptied. People were leaving the family alone with their grief. Aunt Martha was the last to leave, hugging Aurora tightly and whispering, "Hang in there, sweetheart. Call me if you need anything." Theodore got behind the wheel. All the way home, about 2 hours, they were silent. Aurora stared out the window at the passing scenery, thinking about her mother, about teaching her how to ride a bicycle, about family dinners on Sundays, about the last conversation when her mother, already weak, took her hand and said, "Be happy, honey. Just be happy." Aurora tried to call her husband. The phone was off. It was strange. Braxton never turned his phone off. Even in important meetings, he just put it on silent. Theodore glanced at his daughter. 12 years in the drug squad had taught him to trust his intuition, and now it was telling him something was wrong. With about 20 minutes to go, Aurora tried to contact her husband again. The phone was still unavailable. Mrs. Parker's call today came to mind. Music in an empty house? The phone turned off? The music could be heard as far back as the driveway. The bass vibrated in a way that rattled the glass in the windows. Several unfamiliar cars were parked on the front lawn, and 2 young men in worn jeans were smoking on the porch. Theodore parked in front of the house, turning off the engine. The smokers, noticing the car pulling up, hastily put out their cigarettes and hid behind the door. The odor of marijuana could be clearly smelled in the air. "What's going on?" Aurora got out of the car, still not believing her eyes. The front door was ajar, and loud voices and laughter were coming from there. Theodore moved toward the house in silence. During his years in narcotics, he had gotten used to assessing the situation instantly. The dilated pupils of the boys on the veranda, the distinctive odor, the nervousness at the sight of an unfamiliar car. The picture was not a pleasant one. The living room was in complete chaos. 12 strangers, glasses of liquor, music at full volume. There were traces of white powder on the coffee table. Theodore immediately realized it was cocaine, but he kept silent, only clenched his jaw. Braxton stood by the fireplace, putting his arm around the waist of a young woman in a short black dress. When he saw his wife and father-in-law, he turned pale and jerked his arm away. The woman turned around. Beautiful face, brightly painted lips, hair the color of a crow's wing. What the hell is going on here? Aurora's voice trembled. The music abruptly stopped. One of the guests finally noticed the lady of the house. Aurora. Yeah, we... Braxton stammered, shifting his gaze from his wife to his father-in-law. It's not what you think. What am I supposed to think? Aurora looked around the room. My mother is dead. We just came from her funeral, and you set up here. This? The dark-haired woman tried to stealthily step aside, but Theodore blocked her path. Introduce yourself, he said softly. Marilyn Page. She jerked her chin up, trying to maintain her dignity. I'm a journalist. A journalist, Aurora echoed. And how long have you known my husband as a journalist? The guests began to hurriedly disperse. Someone tried to discreetly brush the white powder off the table, but Theodore shook his head. Leave it as it is. There was something in his voice that made everyone freeze. Professional intonations, a tone that had been practiced over the years and made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. Have everyone's papers ready, he continued just as calmly. And nobody leaves the premises. Listen, Braxton stepped forward. Let's not be dramatic. Just a little reunion of friends. Friends? Aurora looked at her husband as if he were a stranger. On the day of my mother's funeral, with cocaine on the table. Marilyn nervously rubbed the strap of her purse. I really should go. No one's going anywhere, Theodore retorted. He pulled out his cell phone and started dialing. Who are you calling? Braxton jerked forward. The station, Theodore answered calmly. There are clear signs of drug use here. As captain of the narcotics division, it's my duty to report. A startled murmur swept through the room. Some of the guests backed toward the exit, but Theodore shook his head. Once again, everyone stay where you are. Aurora watched what was happening as if in a terrible dream. Her home, her and Braxton's family nest, had turned into some kind of drug den. And this woman, Marilyn. From the way Braxton was hugging her, she was clearly not a random guest. I'll explain everything. Braxton looked pleadingly at his wife. Just give me a chance. You will. Theodore nodded, putting the phone away. You will. To everything and everyone. A heavy silence hung in the room. Only from the street came the sound of cars pulling away. Those who had managed to slip out before the owners showed up were hurrying to get away. Marilyn was nervously adjusting her hair. Braxton was growing paler. And Theodore was scrutinizing the living room, taking note of every detail. Aurora slowly lowered herself onto the couch. The black mourning dress seemed particularly out of place now amidst this bacchanalia. What should have been a day of grief and farewell had turned into some surreal nightmare. We should call in the experts, Theodore said softly. There's obviously a lot for forensics to do here. After Theodore's call to the station, the tension in the room became almost palpable. While he and Aurora sat in the living room trying to make sense of what had happened, Braxton had supposedly gone to see if everything was okay in the kitchen. No one noticed that Marilyn had slipped out quietly after him. Aurora sat staring at one point. The events of the day came in waves: the funeral, her husband's betrayal, the drugs in their house. She rubbed the rosary beads her mother always carried with her. Theodore silently put his hand on her shoulder. He, too, was devastated by his wife's death, and this party situation seemed a cruel farce. Meanwhile, the guests were quietly trickling in through the back door into the garden. Braxton hurried them out, whispering his plea that they should not tell anyone what had happened. Marilyn helped him by holding the door. When Braxton returned to the living room, Aurora finally looked up at him. How could you? She asked, quietly. On the day of my mother's funeral. Honey, I didn't think you'd be back so early. Braxton paused, realizing how ridiculous that sounded. You didn't? Aurora stood up. You mean if we'd stayed late at the cemetery, everything would have been okay? A party with cocaine and a mistress in our house is okay, as long as the wife doesn't find out? Marilyn didn't, Braxton began, but Theodore interrupted him. Where are the others? What others? Braxton tried to feign incomprehension. The guests. I told everyone to stay where they were. They probably split up, Braxton mumbled. Theodore silently pulled out his cell phone and started dialing again. A different one this time. Jim, it's Ted. Remember that guy you saw at Foster's last week? I think I just met him in an unexpected place. Yeah, that's right. Tall, unassuming. Right. Braxton turned even paler. That last guest. He'd heard something about a recent drug operation but hadn't paid much attention. Aurora watched her husband, and the day they'd met came back to her mind. 8 years ago, the launch of her company's new line of cosmetics. Braxton had worked then as a financial analyst for the bank that sponsored the event. He charmed her with his confidence and sense of humor. The conversation about numbers and business plans drifted into a discussion of her favorite books and movies. A month later, they were already living together. 6 months later, they got married. Aurora! Braxton's voice snapped her out of her memories. Let's talk privately. About what? She felt tears coming to her throat. About the fun you had while I was burying my mom? Or about you getting involved with drug dealers? I didn't, Braxton stammered. I didn't know who those people were. Marilyn brought them in, said they were her friends. And Marilyn herself? Aurora looked at her husband intently. Is she just a casual acquaintance too? Theodore, having finished talking on the phone, watched his son-in-law carefully. He'd learned to read people over the years, and right now Braxton was like an open book, scared, cornered, desperate to get out of it. Forensics will be here in half an hour, he reported calmly. And there's someone else coming up. That guy you let out the back door. The drug squad's been looking for him for a long time. You know why? Braxton shook his head. He's the liaison between the suppliers and the dealers. Theodore spoke still as calmly, but his tone made Braxton uneasy. And now I'm wondering how he ended up at my daughter's house party. Very curious. Aurora covered her face with her hands. She thought of her mother, of how happy she was to see her married. He's a good boy, Elizabeth was saying. We'll take care of you. From the street came the sound of approaching sirens. Police cars surrounded the house, cutting through the evening twilight with flashing beacons. While forensics worked in the living room, taking fingerprints and collecting evidence, Detective Ramirez interviewed Marilyn Page in the study. I'm really a journalist. Marilyn nervously fixed her hair. I write a column for Metropolis magazine about the city's social life. That's where I met Braxton, at a charity event 3 months ago. She fell silent, remembering that evening. Just another boring event where rich people showed off their generosity. Braxton stood out, smart, charming, with a great sense of humor. He talked about the financial markets in a way that made it sound like a fascinating thriller. Go on, Ramirez was making notes in his notebook. We got to talking. He mentioned that his wife owned a cosmetics company. I was interested. Good material for an article. We exchanged phone numbers. Footsteps were heard in the hallway. Theodore was walking past the office, talking on the phone. He stopped at the door, listening. The article never came out, Marilyn continued. We met ostensibly for an interview, but she lowered her eyes. It didn't turn out that way. Marilyn was the kind of person who always wanted more. Growing up in a small town, she dreamed of fame, success, a bohemian life. Working as a socialite chronicler seemed like a stepping stone to something more. She covered exhibitions, parties, fashion shows. She'd made acquaintances in certain circles. That's where many of the guests at tonight's party were from. Who suggested the party? Ramirez asked. I did. Marilyn bit her lip. Braxton said his wife would be away for the funeral. I thought, God, that sounds so stupid. I thought it would be fun. In another room, the forensics team was finishing up their work. Theodore was going over the preliminary results, the fingerprints on the glasses, the drug traces, the list of items found. He was particularly interested in that tall, unassuming man. How had the drug liaison ended up at a social party? Who compiled the guest list? Ramirez's voice sounded indifferent, but Marilyn grew even more nervous. Mostly my friends. People from the magazine, photographers, artists. I don't know everyone personally. Some brought their friends. She remembered how she'd met Braxton. His interested look, his easy smile, his expensive suit. She knew he was married, but did it matter? In her circles, such liaisons were commonplace. No one took them seriously. Tell me about your relationship with Mr. Holloway. Ramirez turned the page of the notebook. We've been seeing each other. Nothing serious, just a pleasant pastime. He said he and his wife hardly ever see each other. She's busy with her business. Theodore, standing in the hallway, wrinkled his nose. His daughter had indeed been working hard, especially in the last year when Elizabeth had fallen ill. She was torn between the company, her sick mother, and home. Meanwhile, her husband was having fun with his mistress. One of the CSIs called him in. They found something interesting. There were traces of not only cocaine but other substances on the coffee table, and in a vase of flowers, a small bag of pills. Miss Page, Ramirez tapped his pen on his notepad, did you know there were drug dealers among your guests? What? She turned pale. No, of course not. I'm telling you, I didn't know everyone personally. Maybe someone brought... I wasn't thinking... What were you thinking? Came Aurora's voice. She was standing in the doorway of the study, still in her morning dress, gaunt with reddened eyes. Marilyn cringed under her gaze. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. I didn't know about your mom. I mean, I did, but I didn't think... You didn't think, Aurora echoed. None of you did. Theodore looked over the preliminary forensics report. The picture was not a pretty one. It looked like this house had been used for more than just social gatherings, and his son-in-law was more deeply involved than he had first thought. The next morning, Theodore arrived at the station earlier than usual. He'd spent the night awake, going over the foster case files, trying to tie up loose ends. That inconspicuous man from the party, Andrew Keller, was an important link in the chain of drug dealers, but there was not enough evidence to prove his involvement. Ramirez was waiting for him in his office with new information. Forensics showed that the pills found in Aurora's house were from the same batch as those seized last week from the small-time dealer. Fingerprints of people in the foster case were found on some of the glasses. What about Braxton Holloway? Ramirez spread the photos out on the table. Released on his own recognizance. Theodore rubbed his temples. No direct evidence of his involvement in the drug trade yet. Maybe he really didn't know who his mistress brought in. He realized he was biased. Braxton was his daughter's husband, and the desire to put him behind bars was mixed with the need to think objectively. 8 years in their family, doing business together with Aurora, none of that could be discounted. And the journalist? Marilyn Page. Checked her connections. Really writes socialite chronicles, hangs out in bohemian circles. But here's the interesting thing. She's been showing up a lot in places Keller's been in the last 2 months. Surveillance photos popped up on the computer screen. Fancy clubs, restaurants, private parties. Keller always kept a low profile, but his presence was visible to the keen eye. There was a knock on the door. Braxton's wiretap report. Nothing criminal, the usual conversations with bank customers, a few calls to Marilyn. One conversation caught the eye. Braxton was arranging a meeting with someone on Friday. No names or specifics, but the intonation was alarming. Theodore dialed his daughter's number. Aurora didn't answer, just like yesterday, just like the day before. After the party, she had locked herself in a friend's apartment, turned off her phone, and didn't want to see anyone. The friend reported that she hardly ate or slept, lying in bed all day staring at the ceiling. "Boss," Ramirez handed him a new folder. The results of the outdoor surveillance on Foster's house came in. Looks like there's a big deal coming up on Friday. All the major players will be there. Including Keller? Yes. One more thing. Braxton Holloway's car was seen arriving there. Theodore leaned back in his chair, looking at the pictures on the wall. His daughter on her wedding day. Happy, radiant, a smiling Braxton beside her. A photo from last Christmas, the whole family together. Elizabeth was still healthy. "Prepare the surgery," he finally said. "For Friday. We need to take everyone." "What about—" Ramirez faltered. "I'm stepping down from leading the operation." Theodore began to gather papers. "Personal interest, but I will receive full information." He spent the entire day working on the paperwork, mapping out connections, analyzing the suspects' travel routes. The work helped keep his mind off what was happening to his family. About how Aurora was suffering the double blow of her mother's death and her husband's betrayal. That his son-in-law might turn out to be not just an unfaithful husband, but a criminal. In the evening, he tried calling his daughter again. The phone was still disconnected. A friend said that Aurora had finally eaten a little, but did not want to talk to anyone. Even her work had been neglected, and the company used to be the meaning of her life. The phone rang on the desk as the analyst prepared a report on Braxton's finances. Several large transfers from anonymous accounts, strange stock transactions, unexplained spending. The picture was getting more and more unpleasant. Theodore knew he had to follow the letter of the law, but as a father, he just wanted to protect his daughter from pain, from public scandal, from possible problems with her business if all this came to light. For the first time in years of service, he didn't know how to do the right thing. After 3 days spent in her friend's apartment, Aurora ventured outside for the first time. It was a chilly evening, drizzling light rain. She was walking down the deserted street, wrapped in her coat, when a familiar car pulled up sharply beside her. "Aurora, we need to talk." Braxton jumped out from behind the wheel and grabbed her elbow. Before she could say anything, he practically shoved her into the back seat. Marilyn was already sitting there. "What the hell?" Aurora jerked toward the door, but Braxton had already slammed it shut and was back behind the wheel. The car touched down. "Just listen." Her husband sounded pleading in his voice. "We all need to talk calmly. You have to help." "Help?" Aurora shifted her gaze to Marilyn. In the semi-darkness of the parlor, she could see her nervously rubbing the strap of her purse. "What are you two talking about anyway?" "Your father. He's leading this investigation," Braxton began. "He doesn't have to dig any further. You can talk to him." "What?" Aurora felt hysterical laughter rising inside. "You set up a drug den in my house, cheated on me, and now you're asking me to keep it quiet?" Marilyn suddenly raised her voice. "It's more complicated than it seems. If the investigation continues—" "Then what?" Aurora turned to her. "People could get hurt," Marilyn said quietly. "Serious people. They don't like to have their business interfered with." "Shut up," barked Braxton, turning sharply into the alley. "No, let him speak." Aurora felt fear replace anger. "At least someone here is telling the truth." "Aurora, just talk to your father." Braxton changed his tone to a softer one again. "Tell him it was just a normal party, that all this suspicion is a mistake." "And it isn't?" "No," Marilyn said, as if determined to lay it all out. "Those people at the party aren't just party people. They're dangerous. And if your father keeps digging—" "I said shut up!" Braxton turned around sharply and tried to grab Marilyn. Aurora seized the moment and jumped out of the car. Her feet carried her away somewhere in the darkness of the alley. Behind her she heard shouts, doors slamming, but she didn't look back. With shaky hands, she pulled out her cell phone and dialed her father's number. Theodore answered after the first beep. "Dad," her voice trailed off. "Get me out of here, please." She named the street and the number of the house she stopped near. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up beside it. Theodore jumped out of it and hugged his daughter tightly. "They're threatening," Aurora whispered. "Braxton wants me to talk you into dropping the investigation. There are some dangerous people out there." "I know," Theodore replied quietly. "We'll figure it all out." At that moment, Braxton's car showed up at the end of the street. Theodore quickly put his daughter in his car and slammed the door shut, then calmly stood in the middle of the road, blocking his son-in-law's path. Braxton stopped. For a few seconds they stared at each other through the windshield. Then he backed up and disappeared around the corner. Theodore got behind the wheel. Out of the corner of his eye he could see his daughter trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. His son-in-law had just crossed the line from drug suspect to a man threatening his daughter. "It's going to be okay," he pronounced as he pulled onto the main road. "Now I know what to do." Theodore sat in his office studying the forensics reports. The fingerprints from the glasses had yielded some surprising results. 3 previously convicted drug distributors were among the party guests. But the most interesting thing is that Andrew Keller's fingerprints, the same inconspicuous man, were found not only on the glasses. His fingerprints were found on doorknobs, windowsills, even on the railing of the stairs leading to the second floor. Looks like he did a thorough search of the house. Ramirez brought in surveillance footage from the neighborhood. The police tracked all the cars that arrived at the party. They were particularly interested in the black SUV with no license plates that Keller arrived in. "He was at the house for almost 2 hours, Ramirez showed footage of the recording. "Here he comes in here. Here he talks to Marilyn Page in the garden. Then he has a long conversation with Holloway about something. There was a knock at the door. The results of the wiretap on Braxton's phone. In the last 24 hours, he had made more than 30 calls, mostly short, with the same phrase, 'I need to see you urgently.' Across town, Braxton was thrashing around his office at the bank. He tried to contact all the guests at the ill-fated party to warn them of the danger. Many phones were no longer answering, some were unreachable. Marilyn sat in the newsroom staring blankly at the computer monitor. The article about the fashion show was not adding up. Her thoughts were jumbled, her hands were shaking. She was beginning to realize what she had gotten herself into. Her bohemian acquaintances were more than just partygoers. The phone on the desk vibrated a message from Braxton. "Need to meet, right now." She hit delete without responding. Theodore called an operational meeting. The city map on the wall was stacked with red flags, the locations where suspects had appeared over the past week. Several dots formed a clear route from Aurora's house to the warehouses on the outskirts. "We're running the operation tomorrow," he looked around at his colleagues. "The extraction team will be here and here. Surveillance from here. Communication via secure channel only." Braxton paced nervously in his office. Another dialed number was answered with long beeps. The window of his email program was blinking on the computer screen. He'd tried to delete all the correspondence of the last few months, but some of the emails wouldn't go away. Marilyn left the newsroom at dusk. It was drizzling outside. She froze on the porch, hesitating to take a step. It seemed that someone was waiting for her around every corner. The silhouette of a tall man who looked like Keller flashed at the end of the street. She hurriedly caught a cab. Theodore once again checked the readiness of all the groups. The operation must go perfectly. There was too much at stake. He looked at the picture of his daughter on the table. Aurora remained safely under guard, but he was still worried about her. Braxton finally gave up and stopped calling. He sat in his darkened office looking out the window at the evening city. Tomorrow everything would be decided, one way or another. There was no turning back now. Marilyn reached her apartment and checked the locks first. When she turned on the light, she noticed an envelope on the table, which was definitely not there in the morning. Inside was a picture of her talking to Keller in the garden at Aurora's house. The morning began with fog. Unmarked police cars dissolved into the whitish haze, taking up predetermined positions around the warehouse complex. Theodore was in the operations headquarters, deployed in a van 3 blocks from the operations site. "First team in position," the radio speaker faded out. "The second is ready, waiting for the signal." Braxton woke to the ringing of his cell phone. It was Marilyn calling, for the first time in days. "They're here," her voice shook. "There's been surveillance at my apartment. The pictures. I'm supposed to meet them today." "Where?" Braxton frantically pulled on his shirt. "At the warehouses, at noon." "Don't go there." He sprinted out of the house, buttoning his jacket as he went. "I'll handle it myself." In the operations room, Ramirez spread out fresh photos. Out front had caught the arrival of several key players in the case. Keller was one of the first to show up, his black SUV parked outside a distant warehouse. "Boss," one of the operatives handed Theodore a printout. "Got a call from Holloway's cell phone. He's heading our way." Theodore frowned. His son-in-law wasn't supposed to be here today. Something hadn't gone according to plan. Aurora woke up in the rented apartment where she had been placed for safety. The young policeman on duty at the door brought her coffee and fresh newspapers. In one of them, she came across a small notice about an upcoming police operation. Her heart jumped. She knew at once what it was about. Braxton was driving across town, breaking every conceivable rule. His phone was ringing off the hook. It seemed he wasn't the only one who'd heard about the raid. The entire underworld of the city was in motion. "Team 3 in position," the speaker at headquarters came to life again. "Spotted movement inside the facility. Looks like they smelled something." Theodore gave the order to begin the operation. The assault teams moved toward the warehouses simultaneously from different directions. At that moment, Braxton's car flew into the parking lot. "Freeze!" shouted one of the operatives, but Braxton was already running toward the warehouses. Panic broke out inside. People were rushing between containers, trying to find a way out. Keller watched calmly from the second floor of the administration building. A pale Marilyn stood next to him. Aurora was thrashing around the rented apartment, unable to find a place to go. She tried to call her father, but the phone was disconnected. The young policeman outside the door politely but firmly thwarted all her attempts to get out. "Everyone stay where you are!" Loudspeakers blared police commands throughout the warehouses. "The building is surrounded." Braxton froze in the midst of the general commotion, looking around confused. He looked for Marilyn, but it was impossible to see anyone in the reigning chaos. Theodore was directing the operation from headquarters, tracking the movements of the capture teams on the monitors. The appearance of his son-in-law confused the cards, but it was too late to retreat. "It's the police. You have 30 seconds to come out with your hands up." The operation they'd been preparing for weeks began. Assault teams methodically cleared the rooms one by one. Braxton was still inside somewhere. Marilyn stood next to Keller, looking down at what was happening. And Theodore, for the first time in his career, wasn't sure if everything was going according to plan. In her apartment, Aurora turned on the television. The news channels were already broadcasting live from the scene. Cameras from afar showed the cordoned-off warehouses, the police cars, the commotion at the entrance. Somewhere out there was her husband, her father, and people willing to do anything to avoid arrest. After the raid, Marilyn came to the police station herself. She looked exhausted with dark circles under her eyes. Theodore received her personally in his office. "I have to tell the truth." She nervously clutched the cup of cold coffee in her hands. "It all started 6 months ago. I gambled at an underground casino thinking I could write an exposé, but I lost a lot." Theodore listened in silence. In his years of service, he was used to giving people a chance to talk. Keller was there. He offered to solve the problem, said he'd cancel the debt if I helped him. He needed a house, one where he could have meetings, take people in a nice neighborhood, out of sight. She took a sip of already completely cold coffee. I started following wealthy men. I looked for married men, they're easier. Braxton seemed like the perfect match. I went to that fundraiser on purpose, knowing he'd be there. Ramirez came into the office with the new case files. Theodore gestured for him to wait. The plan was simple: have an affair, make him fall in love, convince him to sign the house over to me, and then hand it over to Keller to pay off the debt. That's why he was looking at the house so closely at the party. Theodore nodded. Yeah, I didn't know he was a drug dealer. Thought it was just an underground business, a casino. And then I started noticing strange things. Phone calls, meetings. Braxton was in on it too. I don't know how, but he was obviously in on it. In a neighboring office, Braxton was being questioned at the time. Cornered, he tried to wriggle out of it. I didn't know anything about drugs, he kept saying. Just social gatherings, business contacts. And the house? The investigator placed the photographs in front of him. Why were you going to sign it over to Miss Page? Braxton turned pale. Who told you? She did herself. She's giving her statement to Captain Caldwell right now. Theodore listened to Marilyn's story, and a lot of things were falling into place. Keller's fingerprints all over the house. He was really looking over his future acquisition. Braxton's strange behavior in recent months. He had fallen under the influence of a criminal gang. I didn't mean for things to turn out this way. Marilyn finally looked up. Especially the funeral story. I didn't know, really. Braxton only said the house would be vacant. Theodore stood up and walked over to the window. Behind the glass was the usual cityscape. People hurrying about their business, unaware of the dramas playing out in the offices of the police station. What happens now? Marilyn asked quietly. You will give a formal statement, Theodore turned to her. Against Keller, against the whole gang, and against Braxton, if he was really involved. And me? That will depend on your cooperation with the investigation and on the judgment of the court. Footsteps were heard in the hallway. Braxton was being brought in for a confrontation. Theodore looked at his son-in-law and thought of his daughter, who was waiting at home for news, about how one wrong decision, one fatal mistake could ruin a life, and about how sometimes a confession was the only way to start over. Have a seat, Mr. Holloway, he said in a formal tone. Miss Page has something to tell me about your plans for my daughter's home. Theodore had brought his daughter's case file the day after Marilyn's testimony. Aurora sat in his home office, slowly flipping through the pages of the transcripts, looking at the photographs taken by outside surveillance. Her husband looked like a stranger in the pictures. Business meetings with Keller, conversations with Marilyn at expensive restaurants, and finally that ill-fated day of the funeral when he'd opened the doors of their home to the perpetrators. He wasn't directly involved with drugs, Theodore said softly, but knew about them, covered for them, provided a meeting ground. And the house? Aurora looked up from the papers. He was really going to... Yes, Marilyn confirmed it under the record. There's a draft deed of gift. He's already consulted a lawyer. Aurora stared at the picture of their house in silence. She and Braxton had bought it 5 years ago. Bright, spacious, with a large garden. Mom had helped choose the curtains. Dad had renovated the veranda. And now it turns out her husband wanted to give it all away to criminals. You have a choice. Theodore sat down next to him. We can charge him with accessory after the fact. With Marilyn's testimony, the evidence from the party, and the wiretap tapes, he'll get real time. He was quiet for a moment. Or you could take the deal. He testifies against Keller and the others, makes restitution, and gets probation. What do you want? Aurora looked at her father. I want you to be happy, he answered simply, and for justice to be served. but that's not always the same thing. The phone rang in the next room. Braxton was trying to contact his wife again. He called every day, leaving messages, begging to see her. After Marilyn's testimony, he was released on his own recognizance. The final charge depended on Aurora's decision. "I want to talk to him," she finally said. "Here, in front of you." Theodore nodded and dialed a number. Half an hour later, Braxton was already sitting in his office, nervously rubbing his tie. He had lost weight over the days, shadows under his eyes. "Why?" Aurora asked, looking him in the eye. "Just explain why." "I'm confused," he said quietly, looking down at the floor. "At first it just seemed like a game, a beautiful mistress, interesting acquaintances. Then Keller came along. He knows how to persuade. And when I realized what I'd gotten myself into, it was too late." "So you decided to give up our house?" "They threatened me. They insinuated they knew about your company, your employees." "Don't lie," Theodore interrupted him. "Marilyn told everything. About the casino, about the debt, about your plan." Braxton hunched in his chair. Yes, I agreed to help them get the house. Marilyn promised we'd leave together after the deal. She has connections in Europe, a job at an international magazine. What about me, Mom? Didn't you care?" "I didn't think," he stammered. "I just didn't think about anything." Silence hung in the study. Outside the window, the leaves rustled on the old maple tree, the same one under which he and Braxton had once kissed for the first time. It seemed like it had been in another life. "You have a choice," Aurora said. "Cooperation with the investigation and probation, or trial and jail. What about you?" He looked her in the eye for the first time in the entire conversation. "What will you choose?" "I've already chosen," she stood up. "Divorce, and selling the house. I don't want to live there anymore." Theodore watched them in silence. His daughter was finally becoming what he'd always wanted her to be: strong, capable of making decisions. It was just a shame it had taken betrayal to make it happen. "I'll sign whatever it takes," Braxton said in a muffled voice, "and testify against Keller. It's the only thing I can do." The trial of Keller and his group began 2 weeks after the raid. Marilyn was a key witness. Her testimony helped uncover the entire scheme of the criminal organization. She was confident in the meetings, although Theodore noticed how her hands trembled when she met Keller's gaze. In exchange for cooperating with the investigation, she was offered a witness protection program. A new name, a new city, a new life, away from casinos, dubious connections, and criminal histories. Before she left, she wrote Aurora a letter of apology, but she wouldn't read it. Braxton, contrary to his promise to cooperate, made one last desperate attempt to extricate himself. He hired an expensive lawyer who tried to portray him as an innocent victim of circumstance. Saying he himself had been duped and used, he was unaware of the real goals of Keller and his men. "My client was misled," the attorney broadcast at the hearing. "Miss Page deliberately lured him into this situation, taking advantage of a difficult period in his family life. He was unaware of her connections to the criminal world." However, documents said otherwise. Theodore provided the court with phone records, bank statements, and witness statements. Gradually, a picture of Braxton's conscious involvement in the group's affairs emerged. "He knew who he was dealing with," Theodore said at one of the sessions. "Provided his home for drug dealers to meet, helped legalize funds through the bank where he worked, and planned to turn the property over to criminals." Aurora didn't attend the meetings. She was in the process of selling the house and trying to get the company that had been affected by the whole affair up and running. Customers were nervous. Shareholders were demanding explanations. She had to hold endless meetings, convincing her partners that her business had nothing to do with her husband's criminal schemes. Braxton tried to contact her through mutual acquaintances, past letters, even guarded outside the office. In his messages, he no longer justified himself but simply begged for forgiveness. He wrote that he realized his mistakes, that he was ready to fix everything, that without her, his life had lost its meaning. Aurora put the letters in the desk drawer without reading them. Divorce they formalized quickly. Braxton did not claim anything, signed all the documents without objection. The house was sold for a good price. The realtor found a buyer who was not embarrassed by the scandalous history of this property. When the court found Braxton guilty of aiding and abetting a criminal gang, he finally broke down. During the announcement of the sentence, 3 years probation and a hefty fine, he sat absent-mindedly, unresponsive. Theodore watched his former son-in-law without gloating, only with weariness and frustration. He recalled how 8 years ago he had rejoiced at his daughter's marriage, believing Braxton to be a worthy man. How proud he had been of their joint success when Aurora's company began to grow. How he trusted him to care for his only daughter. Marilyn gave one last interview before leaving, anonymously, without photos. She talked about how easy it is to stumble, how one mistake drags another, how important it is to stop in time. Theodore read the interview and thought she had finally written something worthwhile. Keller was sentenced to 20 years in prison. His organization was crushed, his drug distribution schemes were uncovered, and his property was confiscated. It was a major victory for the police, but Theodore didn't feel much joy. The personal cost of that success was too high. Braxton took a job with a small financial company in another city. It was said that he changed a lot. Quiet, withdrawn in himself, stopped attending social events. Occasionally he would call mutual acquaintances and ask about Aurora, but never tried to contact her directly. The therapist advised Aurora to keep a diary. "Write down everything you feel," she said. "It helps structure your thoughts." The first entries were rambling and angry, about betrayal, about loss, about dashed hopes. Gradually, the tone changed, becoming calmer and more meaningful. Theodore supported his daughter as best he could. On weekends, they went together to the cemetery to visit her mother, then walked in the park, as in childhood when little Aurora shared her secrets with her father. They were silent more often now, but this silence was comfortable, healing. The company was slowly rebuilding its reputation. Aurora fully immersed herself in her work, launched a new product line, rebranded. Her employees supported her. They saw her fighting for their common cause and responded with loyalty. "You know," she told her father during one of her walks, "I don't feel like a victim anymore. Yes, there was pain, but that pain has made me stronger." Theodore nodded understandingly. He had noticed a change in his daughter. She seemed to have matured over the months, becoming more confident, learning to assert her boundaries. There was a new gleam in her eyes, not despair, but determination. The old house was sold, and Aurora bought a small apartment in the city center. She furnished it to her own taste, without regard for other people's wishes. Bright walls, lots of flowers, favorite books on the shelves, a space where one could feel safe. Theodore helped with the renovation, painting the walls, assembling the furniture. Sometimes they would stay up late, drinking tea in the kitchen and talking about everything. He told stories from his police practice. She shared her plans for business development. "Mom would be proud of you," he once said, "the way you're doing things." Aurora remained silent, only gripping her teacup tighter. The pain of losing her mother was still sharp, but now there was a light sadness and gratitude for everything her mother had taught her. Gradually, old friends returned, those who had stayed away during the scandal, not knowing how to react. Aurora learned to distinguish between genuine support and idle curiosity. Some connections were severed for good, but new ones emerged, more honest and deeper. At work, she spent a lot of time with the development team, creating new formulas for cosmetics. The chemistry was soothing, clear formulas, clear reactions, predictable results. No cheating, no ulterior motives. Theodore noticed that his daughter was smiling more, not the social smile she had learned to wear as a mask, but a sincere, heartfelt smile, especially when talking about the company's successes or new ideas for products. "I'm thinking of going on vacation," she once said over dinner. "Maybe to the sea. I've been wanting to go scuba diving for a long time." He nodded approvingly. Travel could be another step toward recovery, new experiences, new horizons, new possibilities. More and more optimistic entries appeared in the diary, about plans for the future, about new projects, about the joy of small, everyday discoveries. The pages about the past no longer caused acute pain. They became just a part of history, a lesson to be learned. Theodore watched his daughter slowly come back to life. Not that old life. She would never be the same again. But a new one, perhaps a more real one, where there was no room for pretense and falsity, where you could be yourself and not be afraid of your feelings. "You know what's the most important thing I've realized during this time?" she asked her father during another walk. "That healing isn't about going back to the way things were. It's about moving forward, toward what will be." The narcotics unit had a new investigator, Mary Ann Ashworth. She transferred from another city after the death of her husband, also a policeman. Theodore immediately noted her professionalism and quiet confidence in her work. No fuss, clear reports, attention to detail. The fall that year was surprisingly warm. Mary Ann often spent her lunch break in the park near the site. On one such day, she noticed a young woman sitting on a bench with obvious signs of a panic attack. Pale face, rapid breathing, trembling hands. She recognized Aurora immediately. Their department had been working on her husband's case for months, and pictures of Captain Caldwell's daughter were in the files. Mary Ann walked over and sat next to her. "Breathe slowly," she said softly. "That's it with me. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Gradually, Aurora's breathing evened out. She nodded gratefully to the stranger. "I'm Mary Ann. I too had panic attacks after my husband died," she said simply. "It will pass. Not right away, but it will." They got to talking. Mary Ann didn't mention that she worked with Theodore. She just listened, occasionally inserting brief comments. She had a gift for making people feel at ease without being intrusive. Since then, they had often met in that park. Aurora found in Mary Ann an attentive interlocutor who understood her pain, not by hearsay, but through her own experience of loss. They talked about work, about life, about coping with loss. Theodore, meanwhile, stayed late at the station more and more often, especially when Mary Ann was there. They discussed current affairs, drank coffee from the vending machine, sometimes just stayed silent, each of them comfortable in that silence. "I want you to meet someone," he told his daughter one day. "A co-worker of mine, Mary Ann. She's special." Aurora smiled. Mary Ann Ashworth? The tall blonde with green eyes? Theodore raised his eyebrows in surprise. "We already know each other," Aurora explained. "Remember I told you about the woman in the park who helped me with my panic attack? That's her." "But why didn't you tell me before?" "Didn't you tell me you'd gotten a special co-worker?" Aurora teased him. "She's wonderful, Daddy. Really wonderful." Theodore was embarrassed, for the first time in his daughter's memory. He didn't know that Mary Ann and Aurora were already friends, that they met regularly in the park, that his daughter had long ago noticed the way his eyes warmed at the mention of his new co-worker. "You know," Aurora said thoughtfully, "Mom always said you deserved to be happy, that someday you'd meet someone who would understand you." Theodore remained silent, staring out the window. Autumn leaves swirled behind the glass, reminding him of how quickly life changes, how unexpectedly answers to unasked questions are found, how fate sometimes connects people in the most amazing ways. "Invite her to dinner," Aurora said. "To our house. I'll make my signature apple pie. You really don't mind?" "Dad, I'm in favor. Very much so." A shadow of worry flashed in his eyes. He remembered what his daughter had been through, how hard it had been for her to trust people after Braxton's betrayal. "She's different," Aurora said, as if reading his thoughts. "And you're different. Everything will be fine." Marianne didn't accept the dinner invitation right away. She paused, staring into her coffee cup, then looked up at Theodore. "Can I bring my younger brother? He works at a research center, recently defended his thesis in organic chemistry. I think Aurora would be interested in talking to him." Theodore smiled, realizing Marianne's intent. She had often talked about her brother Michael, a talented chemist who, after Theodore's wife died, had helped restore some of the lost formulas in Aurora's lab. "Of course," he replied. "I've long wanted to meet the man who saved my daughter's research." On the day of dinner, Theodore watched Aurora fussing in the kitchen. She was clearly nervous. The first family dinner, after all the events. Marianne arrived exactly at the appointed time, followed by a tall, dark-haired man in his 30s, her brother Michael. In his hands he held a folder with some papers. "These are the formulas I was talking about," he said in lieu of a greeting, clearly embarrassed. "On stabilizing natural ingredients." Aurora brightened. "Oh, you brought it. I'm just beating myself up over that problem." They were instantly immersed in a discussion of chemical processes, forgetting about dinner. Theodore and Marianne looked over with understanding smiles. "It seems to have worked," she said quietly. "Did you do that on purpose?" he asked just as quietly. "Of course. They're perfect for each other. Both obsessed with their research, both survived betrayal, both are relearning to trust people." Throughout the evening, Aurora and Michael didn't take their minds off of discussing formulas and experiments. He talked about his research. She shared her plans to develop a new line of cosmetics. At one point, they didn't even notice Theodore and Marianne leave for the kitchen. "You know," Marianne said as she helped Theodore with the dishes, "it's been a long time since I've seen my brother so alive. After the divorce, he shut himself away completely, went to work. And I haven't seen Aurora smile so genuinely in a long time," Theodore replied. From the living room came the lively voices. Michael explained something enthusiastically. Aurora asked questions. They spoke in their own language of formulas and reactions that only they understood. "Shall we give them time?" Marianne suggested. Theodore nodded. "I think they'll make it work. They both deserve it." The kitchen was warm and cozy. Outside the window, the first snow was falling, and in the living room, two people with a passion for science were finding in each other what they had long been looking for: understanding, common interests, and hope for new happiness. Late fall this year was happy with sunny days. In the park near Theodore's house, the maples were burning red and gold, and the fallen leaves rustled underfoot. Aurora and Michael strolled along the alley, passionately discussing the presentation of a new line of organic cosmetics. Their joint research had yielded impressive results. The company was entering the international market. On a bench under an old maple tree sat Theodore and Marianne. He held her hand, occasionally glancing at her wedding ring, simple and elegant, like Marianne herself. They had been married 2 months ago, in a small circle of the closest people. The year had changed them all. Theodore learned to smile again, seeing his daughter's happiness and finding his own. Marianne stopped waking up at night from anxious thoughts. Next to Theodore, she felt protected. Michael came out of his cocoon of loneliness, finding that life does not end with past disappointments. And Aurora, she blossomed, combining a job she loved and a new love. "Look," Marianne nodded toward the young couple. Michael was just passionately explaining something to Aurora, drawing invisible formulas in the air, and she was laughing, looking at him fondly. "They're happy," Theodore said simply. We're all happy, Marianne corrected him. At that moment, Aurora and Michael walked up to them. Shall we go home? I have a pie in the oven. Apple? Marianne smiled. Pear this time, Aurora winked. From a new recipe. The four of them walked home, two couples, two love stories, one family. Loss and betrayal were behind them and life was ahead. Maybe not the easiest, but definitely real. Theodore squeezed Marianne's hand tighter. In the pocket of his jacket was the key to the new house. Big, bright, with a spacious kitchen for family dinners, and a garden where they were going to plant apple trees in the spring. Aurora said something quietly to Michael, and he laughed, openly and happily. They moved into her apartment, turning one of the rooms into a home laboratory. In the evenings, the smell of herbs and essential oils wafted from there. They continued their research even at home. Marianne caught Theodore's gaze and smiled. She knew what he was thinking, about how bizarrely life sometimes worked out, how the shards of broken happiness could be used to build a new, even stronger one, how important it is not to be afraid to start over. And there was one more surprise ahead of them, but Aurora and Michael decided to tell them about it over dinner. After all, the most important news was best shared with the family,